start with this question. I asked the PhD students, how many of you have the ambition of becoming good researchers, really good researchers? And most of them, they raised their hand. How many of you are researchers? How many of you consider yourself good researchers? But you have the ambition of becoming good, better, better and better. Well, then Socrates would ask, but what characterizes good research? And what characterizes a good researcher? And I start my session with trying to focus deeply on this question. And I do it by reflecting on a book written by a Finnish philosopher. The book is called Varieties of Goodness. So in order to understand, and that Socrates would, but in order to be able to identify what characterizes good research and a good researcher, we must know more about this thing called goodness. Isn't that right? What does goodness and good mean? And in this book by Georg Henrik von Wright, he reflects, this is a book about this thing. What is goodness? What does it mean? And he said, well, we can look at everyday expressions. For example, we talk about a good knife, a good horse, a good hammer, a good rod, a good carpenter, a good chess player. We have the world's best player for the time being, Magnus Carlsen. A good politician, they exist. A good teacher, a good lover, a good mistress. These are expressions from everyday life. A good lung, good eyes, good sight, good teeth, good memory, a good head. Then I have made a stippled line, I will come back to that. A good heart, a good taste, a good smell, a good meal, a good wine. Some of us say even a good cigar. A good plan, a good opportunity, a good advice, good luck, good news. And then again, a good man, a good act, a good heart. A good friend, a good physician, a good researcher, good knowledge, good research, good afternoon. And you agree that all these expressions exist in everything. Does anyone of you have a good friend? Have you ever thought about what makes a friend good? What makes a friend good? Huh? Sincerity. Supportness. Reliable. Reliable. Now you have all the characteristics of a good friend are instrumental characteristics.
A good person.
Is it necessary? Is it necessary for a friend to be good that he or she has to be a morally good person also?
No.
Isn't that a bit puzzling?
No, for me no. It has to be morally good.
It has.
By definition of good.
But does that mean that criminals don't have friends?
Because sometimes friends to give some, you ask for advice sometimes. Of course you say there is a my own come to what is good, but sometimes when I am in a quandary on what to do, I ask a friend.
Yeah.
And if that friend has a different view, I may be influenced. And I don't know if I'm now going to do what is right for me.
Yeah.
Not good, but right.
Yeah. Yeah. But you see, even to characterize what makes a friend good is quite complicated.
Yes.
The first observation from Rick says that, well, the fact that we can use these expressions in everyday life illustrates that in general and for the most part we understand what we mean by that. The second observation he makes is that this word goodness is a word, a concept with a whole range of meanings. And then he returns to these everyday expressions, and if you noted, he puts some of these expressions together. And that brings me to the first or the second question. Okay, what do these four goodness formulations have in common? Why has he put them in the same group? What kind of goodness are we talking about here?
Utility.
Utility? Functional. Another word for utility? Use. Von Wright says, or he labels these forms of goodness instrumental goodness. Instrumental goodness. And that brings me to the first research ethics question. Is instrumental goodness important in research?
Yes.
Yes, can you elaborate on that?
For example, good DNA extraction kit. So that means that you get a good DNA, like clean DNA with the high quality. And it means also you have them good reagents, like high quality reagents in it. And it doesn't mean that another kit that you're going to buy, for example, more expensive or more cheap one will have the same quality. So that's important for your research.
So you are doing some kind of basic research, are you?
I'm biology by the major.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm talking about biology.
So, and when you do basic research, you use a lot of instruments.
Yes.
And if you have calibrated
Yes.
an instrument in the wrong way,
That's going to be a disaster.
weeks of work can just go down the drain. Isn't that true?
Yeah.
Are there anybody of you doing qualitative research? Interview studies? Interviewing patients, interviewing healthy research subjects? Well, also they rely on instruments. For example, it can be that they have identified in advance certain core questions they will ask all. And have you noticed among you, I'm absolutely sure that even among you, some of you are more clever in making other people talk. Some of you are better listeners, or are you all equal?
No. Depends on the situation.
So, for example, a qualitative researcher, she is using herself as an instrument. Because if you are not able to communicate, you can be a disaster as a qualitative researcher. Because people, they don't want to tell you the things you try to find out. So would you agree in saying that instrumental goodness is necessary in all kinds of research?
Yes.
How many of you in your research use statistical methods? You use?
Yeah, we do.
Which is an extremely important instrument to generate knowledge. Okay? So to be a good researcher, to do good research, you have to take into account seriously this dimension of goodness. Together also. Why has he put the carpenter, the teacher, and the mistress together? What makes them good? What kind of goodness are we alluding to here? The first was instrumental goodness. Now we have to find a new adjective.
Capacity.
Capacity, yeah, but an adjective. Instrumental goodness, and now goodness. What is this word?
Lost in translation, like.
Professional.
Professional, yes, you are close to the word von Wright proposed.
Skillful.
Skillful. And von Wright say, one thing they have in common, they are all good at something. And he says, label this kind of goodness technical goodness. Have you ever thought about the lower as a technician? They are all good at something. For example, a good politician is a politician who is able to implement his or her politics. A good teacher, what a good teacher is a person who is good at reaching the learning objectives. And the adjective von Wright uses technical goodness. Do you think that dimension of goodness is relevant in research? Can you think of in what way is technical goodness important in research?
The design.
Design?
It can be like good nurse. So she can do like injections really well, so no like bursts, so no
Exactly.
something
Yeah.
like injuries.
So she doesn't leave the patient with a blue arm.
Yes.
Yeah. Other examples from, well, the two of you are using statistical methods as instruments. Are you very good at using those methods?
I'm very good at use statistician.
Hmm?
Statistician. I have a good statistician.
You have a good statistician, so you use the statisticians as an instrument.
Same here.
So it's instrumental goodness.
So it's instrumental good. Yeah.
It's not technical.
Because, for example, a lot of medical researchers, they use statistics. Very few of them really are able to use this method in a professional way. They have to rely on statisticians. And I remember one of the students in the self-declaration notes, he referred to he's using statistics, but he misspelled the word, so he put sadistics. And many students, they find statistics extremely complicated. So sadistic was
Extremely sadistic.
Knut Erik Trane, the philosopher I referred to earlier in my lecture, it was him who made this analogy between the mother tongue language and mother tongue morality. He said it might be useful to think of research consisting of 3 different phases. It is the planning phase, it is the acquisition phase when you start collecting data or interpreting data, and then it's the use, application, communication phase. And let's now, from this dimension of goodness, look how technical goodness comes to play in these 3 different phases. For example, in the search, in the planning phase, the ability to identify the kind of questions and methodologies best suited to research a particular problem represent the form of goodness in the technical sense. Every scientific article needs a review part. Many young researchers consider this, it's an obligation, but they don't understand why. Why do you think the review part is so important in doing good research. Have you thought about that? Yeah? Why?
Because it leads to the research question.
Aristotle, who was the most famous student of Plato, who was the most famous student of Socrates, I think in the first chapter of his book on metaphysics, he said, every time or when you start researching a problem, the first thing you have to do is to find out what has been said about this problem before. And the reason this is so important is that it is, if you do a thorough review, you will be able to identify the questions that have not been researched.
The gaps.
Identify the gaps, the white spots on the map. And this ability requires technical goodness. But there is a lot of sloppiness in research relating exactly to this part of the scientific article. Because many young researchers, they have not understood how important it is to do this part thoroughly. Also, in the second phase of research, technical goodness is important. For example, the ability to sift through large amounts of carefully collected data to provide interpretations that are both plausible, fruitful, interesting, relevant, requires this technical goodness. Many young researchers, they feel completely overwhelmed because they have too much data. They feel they are drowning. Well, then you have to learn to swim. That is, you have to have acquire this technical ability to be able to analyze these masses of data and extract the original, interesting, fruitful, relevant interpretations. So you see also in the second phase, technical goodness is important. What about the third phase? The communication phase. How many of you have published a scientific paper? Raise your hand once more. Almost all of you. How many of you have published a paper in English? How many of you have English as your mother tongue language? Which is, it might be a very, very struggling thing to write scientific things in a language which is not yours. But also, technical goodness is required to be able to make the message come through. Some are good writers, and some are very, very, very low key writers. But that also requires training to acquire this technical ability. Something is inborn, but something you can acquire by training. So here you see how technical goodness is a goodness dimension that is extremely important in doing research as instrumental goodness. What about the third? Why has he put the lungs, eyes, the sight, the teeth and memory and the head together? What kind of goodness are we talking about here?
Physical?
Physical? Perception? One of you have already introduced the adjective, the label. Functional goodness. Here we are. All these expressions refer to functions, cognitive functions or loss of cognitive functions, physical functions, physiological functions. And my claim is that all kinds of medical and health related research is functional research. The fourth type of goodness. We talk about the good taste, good smell, a good meal. I like to cook and have a good wine with my meal. What kind of goodness is this?
Like more personal.
More personal?
Opinional, like your opinion.
Value? Other?
I think perception.
Perception?
Sense.
Senses, yes. Von Wright, he uses an ancient Greek word to characterize this goodness. Hedonic goodness.
Hedonic.
Hedone means
Happiness.
pleasure.
Pleasure.
Happiness is eudaimonia,
So hedonistic means pleasure.
pleasure. What is the opposite of pleasure? No. I want a different word. What is the opposite of pleasure?
Painful.
Yes! And you know, Plato in one of his dialogues, he demonstrates this. He said, you start scratching your
But
buttocks. At first, it's quite pleasurable, but what happens if you continue?
you irritated.
Exactly. So you go from pleasure to pain. My claim is that this goodness dimension is perhaps the most important dimension of goodness in research. Researchers live substantial parts of their lives in ambiences not only characterized by the freedom to seek knowledge, but also by tough competition, temporary forms of uncertainty, and ignorance. In sport we have 3 medals: gold, silver, bronze. But in research in fact we have only gold medals. You have to be the first out. So research is an extremely competitive discipline. And competition might give rise to enormous pleasure. But if you lose the competition, it gives rise to the opposite, pain. Isn't that true? And what does it think about that? What does it mean to be an extremely good researcher? To be the first one out. Have you thought about it? Think about it from a kind of existential point of view. If you are the first out, that means you have entered a terrain where there is no map. How many of you like to feel insecure? You like?
Oh, sorry. You like?
Do you like to feel insecure?
Oh, no.
But A little, but think of that. Of doing really excellent, outstanding research means that you are in a situation where you go beyond your own knowledge. So to be a good researcher, you have to be able to live with this uncertainty, this anxiety. If not, if you withdraw, no, this is too scary.
But then isn't it like there is only like gold medal, you say? But doesn't it mean that it's not like just good, but it's like the best? Because like you can be like good researcher and have, for example, your regional like #1 research like award. But if you have like the Nobel Prize, it's also like good, but it's like better than the good that you have in your like country regional level.
Yeah, the reason I said, because research is so competitive, not everybody can be the first. But if you come second, you will not feel the same amount of pleasure as if you come first. Has anybody, well, several of you said you have published a paper. When you received a letter from the editor telling you that your paper has been accepted for publication, that generates a lot of pleasure, no? Have anybody of you received the opposite letter? Based on the reviews of the reviewers, we are sorry to inform you that your paper has not been accepted for publication. And I tell you, the more senior you become, the more painful it is to receive such letters. Because you think, well, the more senior I become, the more clever I become. But in a way, the more vulnerable you become. So coping with the pleasure of having a paper accepted for publication, a PhD dissertation accepted for defense, or you succeed in receiving new funding, all these things generate a lot of pleasure. But how do you take care of a colleague who, for different reasons, are not progressing as fast, who did not get the funding? Maybe she's envious of you. I used to say, if you take off the shoes of researchers, you will discover something peculiar. Researchers do not have 5 toes on each foot. They have 10. Why do I say this? I say this, there are empirical studies showing that there are more conflicts in research ambiences than in any other ambience. And that relates to research being extremely competitive, but also research being a kind of activity that exposes you to all your limits, ignorance, and uncertainty. Especially if you are doing excellent research. Because then you are doing something where you are the one who make the rules, who draw the map, who fills the gap. So do you see how important this pleasure pain dimension of research is? This hedonic dimension of research. How many of you like to be criticized? That is also part of becoming a good researcher. Because research depends on critique. Have you ever thought, why do we write scientific papers in the way we write them? Why do we publish?
Share the knowledge.
But is it just to share the knowledge? Couldn't it be made then in a much cheaper, much less complicated way than it is today? Why do we have to write scientific papers in the way we write them? We have to follow certain rules of play. Why?
So, it's kind of criteria of my research. If I never published, it means I not do research.
Yes, well, you have all heard this, publish or perish. But the reason why we write scientific articles in the way we write is so that others can critically scrutinize, test the rightness or wrongness of our scientific claims and findings. So we publish in order to be criticized. But if that is the case, then one challenge in becoming a good researcher is to prepare yourself for critique. And also, when you criticize your colleagues, you should keep in mind, for example, I am a reviewer for many scientific journals and also Rose. I always, when I read a paper, I always think this. The author or the authors, they have worked on this piece of paper for weeks, for months. The first thing I try to do, look for the good things in the paper. And then also identify the weak points. Because when you criticize a colleague, it is important to formulate this critique in a way that you encourage your colleague to do something better. Because the way you formulate your critique, you can kill the enthusiasm, you can kill the desire of a colleague to do it better. And very often, if you do that, that generates also conflicts. So think about that. The art of criticizing. We have, as to become good researchers, we have to train ourselves to accept criticism. But we also have to train ourselves to give criticism in a constructive way, not in a destructive way. A colleague of mine, who is now retired professor, while he was doing his PhD, he attended a ethics course for 1 week. The teacher was one of the most famous scholars in social sciences from Norway. He was professor in Chicago and then at Collège de France. His name is Jon Elster. And all the participants in this course, they had, for the exam, they had to write an essay. And my colleague, he wrote an essay, and then Elster wrote on the first page, well, Per, this is not hopelessly bad. Well, this is a kind of critique where you kill a person. So, to give critique in a constructive way requires also technical goodness. And I'm always reluctant, for example, when I propose members of a PhD committee, I am always reluctant to put very young people in the committee. Because some of these young people, when they come into that position, it's like they want to take revenge for all the frustrations they have experienced during their PhD.
That's true.
And they kill. So the art of criticizing requires technical goodness. And the art of receiving critique also requires technical goodness. You have to train yourself for that, prepare yourself for that. Because it's very easy if somebody criticizes you, you start defending yourself immediately. Because you say, this is against me. Unfortunately, sometimes it is against you. Because very many conflicts in academia, personal conflicts, are formulated in a scientific language. Did you know, for example, that the majority of accusations of scientific misconduct is a result of personal conflicts? But the most efficient way of destroying a colleague is to formulate your hate in scientific language. Fifth, there is just one more. What kind of goodness is here? A good plan, a good opportunity, good advice, good luck, good news. How many of you have a PhD? How many of you had a good supervisor? What made this supervisor good? What made him or her good? Why was he or she a good supervisor? Experienced?
Time. He say a priority. He's so priority.
Right.
Yeah.
He gave priority to you?
Yes.
Yeah. Other characteristics?
Intelligence. Intelligence.
Intelligence, yeah.
Coach. It's like a coach.
Like a coach. My supervisor, he was in my PhD, he was my supervisor when he was the rector of the university. He was extremely busy, but every time I went to his office, the administrative building at Blinder, the campus, he gave the impression that he had all the time for me. And for me, this was so valuable. And every session, I was the one who said, I think you have more important work to do, so now I will leave you. He never said, sorry, we have to stop now. Is a good supervisor the one who gives you good advice? What kind of goodness is this? Because it has to do with what characterizes a good supervisor. What is the adjective? What is the label we are looking for? We have identified instrumental goodness, technical goodness, functional goodness, and the goodness related to my biscuits, hedonic goodness. Some would say beneficial goodness. That is kind of goodness that leads to good results in some way. Something that benefits you. When you say good luck to a person, what you have in mind is that this person will experience some good consequences, no? So is beneficial goodness a goodness dimension important in research? Yeah, think for example, how many of you have written a research proposal? If you had written a research proposal in the context of medical and health related research, stating, I want to do this research for this and this reason. I don't have a clue whether this research will be utile. Do you think you would get money? In mathematics, you can ask for funding and you don't need to bother whether this research will benefit somebody. But if you try to access funding for a research in medical and health related research, if you do not take this dimension seriously, you will not get funding. You have to show in some way that this will benefit somebody. But it's a pitfall in that also, because there is a lot of hype that you promise much more than you will ever be able to realize. The last dimension. Why has he could put the good man, the good act and the good heart together? What kind of goodness is this?
Kind. Personal? Or personal?
Personal, kind. I'm an old man.
Like moral?
Like moral, yes. But do you see now? We have identified 6 different dimensions of goodness. And the final one was moral goodness. But what does moral goodness in research mean? What does it mean to be a morally good researcher?
Misconduct. No misconduct. Like, yeah.
No misconduct.
Be honest.
Be honest. Yeah. Avoid fabrication, avoid falsification, avoid plagiarism, include the authors that should be included, give credit to those who should be credited, not exclude some you hate who have done tremendous good job, not force yourself upon the papers of your students if there is no justification for that. You agree? But do you see, to become a good researcher, to do good research, it is not sufficient to be morally good. You have to be technically good. You have to observe the instrumental goodness dimension. You have to take seriously the hedonic dimension, the functional dimension, the beneficial dimension. Well, next week we will talk more about moral goodness in research. I will just highlight one thing. Perhaps the most important thing of being honest in research, of being morally good in research, is if you start cheating, then your trust will be eroded. Trust, I used to say, the most important resource in research is not brain power. It is not money. It is not access to patients or healthy research subjects. It's not technical equipment, it's trust. Because if trust is eroded, you will do a lot of damage to research.